What if the most wholesome kids films had something darker lurking beneath the surface? I've taken 4 beloved childhood classics and reimagined them as frightening horror movie posters, and the results were surprisingly rather terrifying. First up, A Bug's Life, which I have a feeling a few of you may not have watched, so let me know in the comments. Let's turn Flick into a tiny axe-wielding maniac. So for this one, I wanted to take A Bug's Life and give it a full-on The Shining treatment, specifically inspired by the iconic axe through the door scene.
Here's Johnny!
So I started with this wooden texture and overlaid a chipped hole right on top. Next, I brought in our little guy Flick and placed him behind the door to make him look like he's peeking through. I then duplicated his body so I could have parts of him poking out in front of the wood, giving him that layered coming through the door type of effect. I also found this image of Flick with a slightly more menacing expression, so I clipped out the face and placed it right over the original. And of course, what's a broken door without an axe? I added one in hand and positioned it naturally. And just a little design trick, I noticed that the new face of Flick was a little bit pixelated, so I used a subtle surface blur to smooth out some of those pixelated lines.
Nice.
As with every other evil character in the series, Flick needed some evil red eyes. I used a hue and saturation mask and painted them in, and that alone gave him a way more threatening stare. Now the door texture itself didn't quite fit the Pixar aesthetic, so I swapped it out for this cleaner version and it matched way better. From there, I started building up the shadows, especially around Flick's body and inside of the door frame to add that much needed depth. And to imply that something far darker has happened, I threw on a red handprint as if someone had desperately tried to hold the door shut. Is that too far? For the title, I placed A Bug's Life text inside a large red splatter, dropped a shadow underneath and stuck it straight onto the door. And for the background, of course, it had to be a bit of a nod to The Shining, so I added this classic hallway scene. After a few tweaks in the camera raw filter to really pull it all together, A Bug's Life horror poster is finished. I think this one came out really fun for such a quick and simple design. However, if you do hear a little tiny axe just hacking away at your front door, I'd recommend maybe not opening it unless you want to get like a little axe through your toe or something. Next up is Paddington. Normally, he's the politest bear in London, but what if he swapped his taste for marmalade for something a little bit more sinister? So let's start by importing our little Paddington bear. And straight away, we're swapping him out for this friendly looking fella. A quick alignment to get him in place, and now it's time to dress him up and blend him into his new clothes. Now, every evil bear needs a pair of evil red glowing eyes. Next, using a low exposure, I dropped in a shadow under the rim of his hat and darkened Paddington overall so I could start building my own light source through some carefully placed highlights. We're then going to import this image and very politely steal one of Paddington's arms. I placed it in front of his body and blended it in using a soft eraser. Now, what might Paddington be holding? A nice map of London? A classic marmalade sandwich? Not quite. No! Now, I thought it'd be fun to show a reflection of Mr. Brown on the blade, so I aligned him up, clipped him up into place, and I just needed the right blending options to make it feel like an actual reflection. A few shadows and highlights added with an exposure mask really helped sell the realism. Now, Paddington was still looking a little too clean for what I had in mind, and so I threw in some innocent looking red splatters across his clothes and, of course, onto the blade itself. Using a black layer mask, I added some dramatic lighting across his body to dial up this sinister vibe even more. For the background, I brought in this eerie forest scene, like Paddington is lurking in the woods, silently stalking the Browns. And of course that had to be reflected onto the blade too to keep everything consistent. Something still felt like it was missing, and when in doubt, I like to just throw in a friendly dose of arson. And so I imported this huge image of a flame. And to blend it into the scene, I added a warm orange and yellow highlight onto the edges of Paddington to show light hitting from behind. Then I realised if Mr. Brown's facing the fire, his reflection should also be orange too. These floating fire embers helped tie it all together with a little bit more atmosphere. At this point, I realised I was missing an opportunity for a much cooler composition. So I brought in a much larger weapon, one that could completely cover half of Paddington's face, and replaced it with a reflection of Mr. Brown's face instead. This gave it that really dramatic half and half split effect I was after. And finally, for the title, I used the liquefy tool to create this menacing dripping effect and threw on a few texture overlays. And just like that, our Paddington horror poster is complete. And so here he is, Paddington on his marmalade-fueled massacre. I definitely wouldn't recommend taking this little bear home. Next up, Frozen. However, this time Elsa didn't quite let it go, but instead held on to rage, revenge, and a little bit of frostbitten terror. Let's start by transforming Elsa into an evil ice witch thing. Of course, starting with the icy blue skin tone. Moving onto her hair, we're aging it up and toning it into this cold, lifeless grey. Her eyes were looking a little too friendly, so I swapped them out for this much more haunting image to give her that whimsical, demonic look I was going for. Next, I dropped in hue and saturation mask to darken her outfit to this muted grey tone. The image was still feeling a little too flat, so I added in some deeper shadows around the body to bring out that sense of depth. To really push forward that witchy aesthetic, I added some visible veins across her face and darkened her eyes. A few darker highlights through her hair also helped sell the aged, sinister look we were going for. Then I hopped onto Envato Elements, link in the description for a free trial, and found this perfect ice texture to overlay across her skin, giving her that final frosty demonic finish. Now let's set the background. So my idea for this design was to create a scene depicting an old TV in which Elsa is reaching out from, turning anyone watching into ice. And in this case, the cursed film which calls her is of course Frozen. Now I didn't want just the viewers to be turned to ice, but also the whole room itself. And therefore I added these icicles across the TV and also added them above the frozen windows. Then to brighten things up, I added a cool blue overlay as if this ghostly glow from a TV is spilling out and lighting up the whole space. Using perspective warp, I brought in this cracked snowflake pattern and placed it under the TV, as if the floor is so cold it's starting to split. I then layered it with an additional ice texture to enhance the frozen effect, but the TV still wasn't feeling ghostly enough. And so I added these whimsical glowing streaks bursting out from every side. To build the room, I placed an armchair on either side of the TV and added the same blue reflections across the forward-facing surfaces, and then colour matched the fabric to the rest of the scene. From here, I covered the whole image black and raised around the light sources to carve out some high contrast highlights and direct the focus. Now the room was almost complete, but it still needed some unfortunate victims. So I imported this sorry soul and placed him standing in front of the armchair as if he's just stood up in fear. A blue hue and an ice texture overlay turned him into a full ice statue. And for the second unlucky soul, I wanted a single frozen arm just reaching out on the floor. The scene still felt a little too static, so I added this blue swirling magic coming from Elsa's hand, almost like she's mid-spell, actively freezing the man in front of her. And because I was already this far, I thought why not just add a snowstorm into the room too. Finally, for one last detail, I duplicated the man's arm and gave it a colour overlay, added a Gaussian blur, and just like that, we've got a shadow cast realistically across the frozen floor. And here we have our Frozen horror poster design. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Now it's time to ruin one of my favourite Disney films, Cars. Lightning McQueen may not be racing anymore as he's now lurking in the shadows, waiting for his next victim. Now let's turn McQueen's frown upside down. Wait, that's not right. No, because we're giving him a frown. First thing, we're removing these cheerful looking teeth and swapping them out for these rather much sharper, more sinister ones. To give them that mechanical edge, I dropped on a metal overlay and added this outer rim, so they look like they're sitting inside the mouth, tucked behind the frame. Next up, let's throw on some shadows using a low exposure to build out a bit of depth, both on the teeth and around the frame. If you haven't already figured it out, McQueen is now a full-on evil man-eating machine. And sadly for little Gary here, all that's left of him is this single arm. I used puppet warp to bend the arm into place, positioned it behind the teeth, a few more shadows underneath, and it's looking pretty gruesome. As we've now firmly established, evil characters need red eyes. But that idea actually became quickly irrelevant because I decided to just cover his whole face with this huge dust cloth, as if he's maybe hiding in the back of some forgotten garage. I wanted something old and creepy looking, and so this fabric worked perfectly. Now, in order to create a 3D draped over effect, it was quite a tedious process. But essentially, I just used lots of different exposure masks and was just creating individual areas which would help portray the shape of the car. And surprisingly, I didn't actually think it looked too bad. I also bumped up the exposure just behind the eyes to show this beaming light cutting through the fabric. Now, McQueen had actually just raced through a tomato farm, and therefore I added these red splatters across the cloth, and threw in a few extra shadows just to reinforce the draped shape. For the background, I brought in this grimy garage scene and extended the floor using generative fill. The overall lighting felt way too bright, so I dropped a black overlay to take control of the mood and direct the highlights. And since he was fresh from the tomato fields, I placed McQueen in this murky red puddle, and even added some red stained teeth to tie it all together. I built out the scene further by opening up the garage door, revealing radiator springs in the distance. And naturally that meant some warm orange light spilling into the room, so I used an orange hue adjustment. I also noticed these lights hanging up too, which could double as a secondary light source. So I added some color overlays, played with the blending modes, and gave them a nice eerie red glow, in which I also reflected across the back of lightning. Finally, I just cluttered the space with some industrial looking objects such as pipes, metal tubing, dirty exhaust smoke, just to make everything feel much grittier. And with that, our Evil Cars poster is ready. From racer to razor-toothed demon, this version of McQueen probably wouldn't make it to the next Disney sequel. And so that wraps up my latest batch of horror movie posters. Which redesign was your favourite? The evil rampaging Paddington, Elsa's cursed film, Lightning McQueen's garage of gore, or Flick's little unhinged shining moment? If you guys want more of these horror remakes, then check out this video here. Or if you want to watch me turn myself into a badass superhero Marvel movie poster, check out this one here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one in a bit.